And in fact, the average age of the ATP holder in the United States is falling.
Okay.
It's the youngest it's been in 8 years.
Yeah. All right. Welcome to this episode of Inside Aviation. I'm Ryan.
I'm Kevin.
We've got a really exciting guest today. JP Hampstead joins us from our media group's research department to talk about the latest trends in pilot hiring in the aviation industry. There's been a lot of news in recent months, a lot of changes in the pilot hiring world and coming off of COVID. And we did a deep dive white paper into what's going on and what's driving these changes. JP's here to talk more about that. Here with JP, one of our senior analysts at Firecrown.
Yep.
Wrote a great white paper. You can find it. We'll put a link in our bio, but about airline pilot hiring. There's been a ton of news about this recently, and I want to kind of get your thoughts on the high-level findings that you all found while doing this really in-depth research about why these airlines are really slowing down pilot hiring from record levels during COVID.
Yeah, our research project was really motivated by some of the headlines coming out from the airlines like Southwest and Delta announcing, reductions in their projected hirings or even like just outright pauses in their hirings for the rest of this year. And we were trying to figure out why that happened because the conventional wisdom was that there was a pilot shortage. And so we dug into a lot of the numbers. We looked at for example, the fact that the growth in airline pilots on airline payrolls had outstripped passenger growth. If you're looking at like TSA throughput, it had outstripped the actual ASMs, the growth in ASMs flown by the airlines, right? We compared things like the number of pilots on airline payrolls to the number of airplanes possessed by the airlines, right? And found that there are now more than 12 pilots per aircraft at all of the publicly traded airlines, which is the highest ratio in over a decade. And we considered other factors too, not just, the fact, we kind of we dug into sort of the pipeline of pilots and how they're produced and sort of, we see a big bubble coming actually in young commercial pilots that will eventually work their way up into ATP land. But just the sheer sort of record production of ATPs in the past 3 years was really remarkable. I mean, we were seeing years where, there were 9,000 new ATPs in a year or 6,000 new ATPs in a year. I think 11,000 in 2023. Which are just
incredible,
massive numbers, for an industry that was used to producing maybe 5,000 a year or 4,000 a year. And so even though there was that big deficit in 2020, the way that I'm thinking about it is that, yes, there are some airlines that will continue to grow and continue to hire, but the pressure in the labor market and the dynamics in the labor market and, the situation of the unions really having a lot of pricing power and being able to force through really aggressive salary increases, I think that is what's shifting. I just think that the labor market for pilots is in general going to become significantly looser over the next few years.
Does that, you guys, you analyze the 5 major airlines, right, in the U.S.?
We actually did. It was like 15 or something. It was all.
Okay.
We did all the regionals as well.
Oh, as well. Okay, so it's across the board completely. That's wild. Yeah, the 9,000 ATP number, I didn't know that until the white paper. That's pretty substantial.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So the airline schools sort of, are aware of this, they study these numbers, and they produced a lot of, there was a really big pilot shortage for a long time. There was about a 10-year period where there were 100,000 ATPs in the US, and that number didn't really move. Salaries came up a lot, and then the number, a lot more people wanted to become pilots. Now they're about, I want to say there are 300,000 ATPs in the US. And that's 50% growth since about 2019, when there were about 200,000. So, the pilot population has grown a lot in the past, call it 5 years.
I think,
it's finally sort of catching up, and now it's actually to the point where, we think that the airlines are going to have to, cut capacity this year, and some of them are blaming it on lack of aircraft delivery, but there's also just the unit economics of some of these airlines, Spirit, but also United and American. They're losing money on a sort of passenger margin per ASM basis.
So, you kind of segued it about these delivery delays, and that's been a very, very significant amount of headlines as well. Is that, of course, we have the problems with Boeing. Most of these airlines that are large Boeing operators, United, Southwest, have cut their delivery estimates this year in half. That's substantial. How much, if you kind of had to put an estimate behind it, or what you saw in the white paper, of this sort of changing pilot hiring trends is actually related to those delivery delays? Or do you think it's kind of a combination of the macro trends plus the delivery delays?
I think it's a combination, because there are already too many pilots per plane in the airline industry. And again, a number of these airlines have been underwater on passenger margins since COVID. And that's sort of an interesting number that you don't see reported because it's not reported. Typically, airlines report revenue per available seat mile, and then they report total passenger revenue separately. And so we went back and calculated, okay, you take the passenger revenue, you divide it by the ASMs, then you subtract CASM from that, right? And you find like what the actual passenger margin is per ASM. And we did that for every airline going back every quarter, back 10 years to look at those trends. And yeah, and there are a few, that are, typically it appears that they try to sort of break even or make like a penny or two per ASM on passengers, and then with the rest with like loyalty programs and other things like that, like is like the really high margin part of their business. But when they're losing, 2 cents per ASM, that makes it really hard for them to make money consistently.
Did you guys look into the retirements coming up and how that's going to affect the supply?
We did. We did, and the estimates that we saw suggested that, first of all, there are ways to sort of paint those statistics to make the situation seem like very dire. But when you actually sort of squint and look at them and ask yourself what you're actually looking at, it's quite different. So, and I'll give you an example. People will say something like, in 15 years, over the next 15 years, 50% of the pilots are going to retire. It's like, okay, well, that just means that they're all having 30-year careers.
Yeah.
Average pilot's halfway through their 30-year career.
Kind of incredible.
That's like a normal.
Yeah.
That's fine.
It's actually right. Perfect.
Yeah. So we saw statistics like that were framed in like alarmist ways that we tried to unpack. But then we also looked at estimates that, suggested that, approximately 4,300 pilots are aging out every year. And new ATPs have exceeded that number every year for the past 10 years, except for 2020, when I think it fell to like 4,100 or 4,000.
Gotcha.
So, the forced retirements are not actually going to be an existential issue. And in fact, the average age of the ATP holder in the United States is falling.
Okay.
It's the youngest it's been in 8 years.
Yeah.
It's still, I think it was like in 2000, I think it was 46. Now it's like 50. It had gotten as high as like 52. So it's basically trending back down, and you'd expect that because there are more new ATPs coming in than there are people aging out.
Yeah,
so the average age is going to get pulled back. It's not the greatest situation, but again, if the average pilot's 50 years old, they've been flying for 15 years, and they have another 15 years left, is that a problem? Not really.
Yeah. I think the overall just sentiment and, with flight schools and the industry is, everybody's focused on the airlines. But I think we're not looking at like 135 operations and also the whole advanced air mobility sector that hasn't even like really taken off.
No pun intended.
And no pun intended. I think it's going to be a big piece of this for pilots. Like it's going to be, like we're going to have all these ATPs ready to go to the airlines, but there's going to be all these other opportunities popping up that aren't 121. Did you guys check that out?
Certainly. We did not look into those simply just because of a lack of like public data on a lot of those operators. But, anecdotally, it seems like some charter operators have also seen things loosen up. People. That's how we talked to one small operator that had a few aircraft, and they said that a few years ago they were getting one or two. They had really high standards for the kinds of pilots that they led, like sort of fly charters for them, and they said that they would only get one or two what they consider to be qualified pilots per job a few years ago, and now it's like 8. So, also seeing things loosen up there. But I agree with you that there's a whole world of pilots, and pilot jobs, out there, and we're sort of looking at the kinds of companies that Wall Street cares about.
Yeah,
that kind of thing.
Yeah, that does make sense.
Yeah, well, and I think the other thing that is interesting, kind of in parallel to while y'all were working on this paper, there was a lot of murmuring in Congress about raising the retirement age to 67. Now, since the reauthorization bill came out, that's no longer the case. And that's not the ICAO standard around the world. But there was certain, on one side of the argument, there was a claim that it would help with, quelling the pilot shortage. And I think a lot of people...
Was that Airlines for America?
No, it was, there's a few senators and representatives who believe that. Just kind of curious, if kind of hypothetically, if that were to be the case, ICAO were to adopt the standard, would it make a big difference at all, or would it just kind of be a net zero type of gain for the industry?
I think it would definitely extend, the careers of sort of late career captains and things like that, which might free up pipeline for to get people from the right seat to the left seat and the right and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Training of first officers and things like that. But because the average age of ATP holders is moving down, it doesn't seem like it's necessary. Yeah.
Ryan, do you think it'll get back to 2010 type of hiring where FOs are making $25 an hour?
No, I definitely not. I think the market's spoken for how much an airline pilot's worth, and for some, especially on the regional side, at 100%. They were making, like you said, basically minimum
25 maybe it might have been high.
Minimum wage with some of these operators on the regional side, and now it's kind of been right sized, right, to be a more competitive opportunity. And I think, I think the other thing that a lot of people don't think about, including those in Congress, is the cost of flight training to become an airline transport pilot is substantial. It can be hundreds of thousands of dollars. And you have to sort of put money behind that at the end of it to help with that debt. And you see it in other fields, right? You see it in medicine, you see it in law, where people do incur a significant amount of debt, but they have a career at the top level that pays a very significant amount. And I think that's what you're starting to see recognized on the airline pilot side as well.
What changed that sentiment? Because for a while they were just treating them like trash. Was it the 1,500 rule? Was it?
I think it was again COVID coupled with some pilot shortage in around 2019 and 2020. You also have to remember too that for better or for worse, a lot of people retired during COVID and took the early outs, and that sort of exasperated, I think, the shortage a bit.
Yeah.
But ALPA says there never really was a shortage, and I don't think that's fully true. JP can chime in here too, but
it definitely seems like there could have been a shortage, because from like 2000 to 2010, like the total number of pilots barely grew, while the number of like passengers and ASMs was growing. And so I could see that. I agree with Ryan that COVID was really a watershed moment that simultaneously took a lot of people out of the workforce, but also made operations way more complex and demanding for many different kinds of companies, including transportation companies and like I think of a company like UPS, where the union also like seized the opportunity to like negotiate much higher wages and things like that. And so I do think it was a moment when the labor was able to sort of hold the reins of power and maybe have their earnings growth to sort of catch up to where they thought it should be. But it was just simply a moment, I think.
But we're not just seeing that in the airline industry. I mean, it's happening.
Yeah, it happened everywhere
across the whole supply chain network.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like in a number of industries saw like temporary labor shortages, whether due to like death or sickness or simply people getting paid money by the government and not needing to work as much, while seeing their operations become immensely more complex. Yeah, and so they like needed more people than ever, and didn't have access to them, and so they eventually had to pay up.
So do we see this trend continuing into the future of hiring staying at this current pace or slowing down?
So I don't necessarily know that I do think that you're starting to see airlines cut capacity going into the fall. I think they may need to let demand catch up to supply for maybe like 18 months to 2 years. But in general, to me, it's not so much a question of is this like a downturn for the aviation industry so much as it's pressure being let out of the labor market. So there could be airlines that want to hire tons of pilots, and they'll find it easier than they did in the past to hire them and find them.
Yeah,
that's kind of our thesis.
Got it.
I want to talk too about the regional side, because they're not quite out of the woods yet. I think in terms of how they're hiring, and we certainly hear quite a bit of voicing from their leadership about that. I think the problem on the regional side isn't FOs anymore. They have a stockpile of FOs. Many of them do. I think a lot of it is captains and retaining captains and moving, keeping them in that left seat. And there's been some very lucrative bonuses coming out. I mean, GoJet, who operates for United, kind of a smaller, not a small airline, but it operates CRJs only for United Express. And they said that they are putting out a bonus that's worth about $300,000 for a first-year direct entry captain when all's said and done. And that's substantial for a smaller, medium-sized company like that.
Direct entry?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I wonder...
So does that mean a first-time captain?
Yeah, that would be their total earnings for the first year if it all goes away.
Oh, okay.
But I mean, that's someone who's never been a captain before.
No, well, they have to have the right amount of hours to come into that left seat role. But
it's to be an FO at the company already and get the.
No, you have to direct entry. You have to come in.
I don't know.
Oh, dude, that's what you meant by direct.
Yeah.
So no, I mean, there are companies like a smaller regional airline with very specific types of candidates they're looking for, right? That have that can fly a certain kind of aircraft, a certain amount of experience, lives in a certain geographic area. Yeah, those sorts of recruiting issues haven't gone away. Certainly what we were talking about is just sort of the fungible ATP holder, and the more specific you're and the thinner the slice of the market that you're willing to consider for a job, the harder it's going to be to fill. But yeah, there are always going to be companies with very specific needs that you either need headhunters or recruiters or people to locate the 20 people that fill their criteria.
Yeah, it's quite interesting to see, because during COVID and right after COVID, regional airlines were hit kind of the hardest in a way where people saw the big paychecks coming out of the big airlines and just left in droves. You know, it wasn't a question of seniority anymore. It was a question of, okay, wow, even if I leave this regional airline tomorrow, I can make, you know, 40% more money. But it resulted in, you know, I know at peak times during COVID, there was American said they had about 100 regional jets grounded, just completely not utilized at all because they just didn't have enough pilots for it. And just recently in Delta's last earnings call, their president said that they still have about 100 underutilized regional jets, which means they're not being fully utilized with the cycle time. So I don't know. I think it's still a problem at the regionals, and I think it's something that people discount in a way, I think, because the regionals don't always carry as much voice, right? Because they're not always public. There's two regionals that are publicly traded, but they don't have that voice that the majors have.
Yeah, they don't have like the brand recognition among the consumer necessarily.
Right, and exactly. And I think but it's also, you have to remember how important the regional airline network in the U.S. is. You know,
couldn't get to Chattanooga without it.
Yeah, there you go.
So can they afford, like, so hypothetically, if the regional airlines have to, you know, raise pilot salaries in a way to make them, you know, remotely competitive with the airlines or with the, you know, the majors, can they afford to do that? How do the economics of that work? What are their options here, Ryan?
Well, I think their options, they have a few, which is the first one has already been utilized, which is not using as many regional jets, and, you know, grounding some or just not utilizing them as to their full potential. But I think the other one that is really kind of going to be interesting to see is how long these bonuses can go, right? Yeah. So you have these, like I just said, $300,000, substantial even for a smaller, you know, regional airline. And it'll be really interesting to kind of see what happens, if those bonuses will continue. I've heard some murmurings from large regional airlines that they're going to be cutting their FO bonuses altogether because they don't need as many anymore. But there's still that strong need for captains. Regional airlines are kind of weird in the U.S. where there's a couple that are their own companies. They're not subsidiaries. But then you have, for example, American has 3 subsidiaries, which are wholly owned. Envoy, PSA, and Piedmont. And they're basically American Airlines employees, right? They get the same flight benefits. They get an employee ID number. So it's kind of the same entity or same company, just different entity. And so, but it kind of makes it that big brother airline has to front that cost, right? It has to find a way to put that in. And, but if you're, you know, a Mesa or a SkyWest and you're your standalone company, you have to figure that out. And sometimes that's going to your clients, which are the major airlines, and saying, look, guys, we can't run this capacity that you want us to because A, we can't afford it, or B, we don't have enough staff to run it. And you're seeing a lot of that change. Like SkyWest is introducing a charter operator, which has kind of been controversial because it skirts the 135 and 121 gradient. But are
they trying to compete with like JSX?
Yeah, it's the same structure. They kind of started it with the whole investigation now of the FAA, but they're doing that because you can get a pilot in the right seat with way fewer hours, and frankly, you know, not pay them as much. But it also helps preserve that small community air service, which is so important for a lot of these, you know, small essential air service markets around the country that they, you know, I had never seen this before, ever, and I was shocked to see it. But it was in 2021 when SkyWest said, look, we're cutting service to 29 essential air service cities, government subsidized. And now they haven't done all of them, but they did a couple of them. They pulled service all together. They said, we can't do this anymore. Even with the subsidy, it doesn't pay.
Wow.
There's a fee if you do that.
Well, now it's actually, you have to go through a whole process. It makes it much harder. But so yeah, it's fascinating how this will work. And it's, you know, SkyWest has actually it's the largest regional airline in the U.S. They've performed extremely well last year in terms of on-time performance. Their balance sheet is actually pretty good. Wall Street tends to really like them. There's a great Seeking Alpha article for any of those who might go out and read those about how if you're going to invest in an airline, they're the one to invest in.
Interesting.
So it's really interesting to see this kind of change because the majors have gotten a lot of limelight recently, but now it's like, well, these regionals aren't quite out of the woods yet, and they got to figure out what to do.
And yeah, and maybe they have, you know, the major airlines have, you know, grossly inflated some of their cost structure, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if the regionals haven't done that yet, I can see why Wall Street might like that.
Yeah.
And yeah, maybe there's a shelf life on how long that's going to last.
And I see it, the major airlines certainly grossly inflated their cost structure, no question. And then you add in the Boeing and Airbus supply chain issues, you're in this perfect storm. But on the regional side, you don't have that problem. They're either operating jets that are already delivered, like CRJ 700, 900, or Embraer, which has been rapidly delivering airplanes all through COVID. They've been doing a fantastic job. So I think they've inflated their costs in a way just due to inflationary factors. Also, obviously raising the wages for pilots, which they needed to do. But I look at it for them more as a right sizing than I do as a gross increase, because it needed to happen on the regional side. They needed to bump the pilot pay up a little bit, and get it to a point where it's sustainable and people can start paying off these, wicked, debt. Because I know I'm kind of on a tangent here, but think about, who's coming into the regional airlines. There's people out of flight schools, right? If you're in the military, you're generally going to go right into the majors. You're not going to go to the regionals first. You don't need to. You have enough hours.
Yeah, I mean, the military's having their own problems too.
And they are too, and that's
pilots. Yeah.
I guess the other big question about sort of the future of the pilot market, or the market for pilots and hiring, is sort of like what you think passenger demand does in the next year. There are a lot of people that are like fairly bearish on the economy, kind of watching GDP slow down. There are other people who are, less worried about it. But I mean, say you look at like the revolving credit statistics published by like the Fed, and you see that, okay, over the past 5 years, the average interest rate on like credit cards has gone up from like 16% to like 22%, and then you see like the balance has increased by like
significantly,
by like 20%. Yeah. And you run the math, and you're like, oh wow, like the average like interest payment is up like 62% in the past 5 years. Which auto loan delinquents are hitting numbers last seen in like 2008, right? So it's like they're definitely. And I don't know how airline analysts think about this. Maybe you can answer this question, but it seems like on the consumer side, there are reasons to be like, maybe they're tapped out. Maybe they're sort of at the limit of their wallet.
Yeah.
Will, TSA throughput numbers like be flat for a year?
It's interesting though, because about a year ago, I think it was, when student loan, or probably a little less than a year ago, when student loans had to be paid back, getting credit card debt all the time high, the COVID stimulus payments are running out. You're running into this perfect storm. And I think the Wall Street analysts, even myself, kind of thought, okay, this is going to be the moment, that the crossroads, right, where this record demand coming out of COVID, where there's a little bit more discretionary consumer spending power, was much higher, but now it's changing, right? Because there's these inflationary factors, and let's not discount too that just you have interest rates are high, you have the student loan stuff, but you also have just general inflation, right? Things are more expensive, and it's kind of interesting.
My beloved dollar menus.
Yeah, exactly. I know, and so, but it's interesting to see what happens here, because I think the Wall Street analysts especially were really concerned about this, but it hasn't proven true yet. They haven't seen a significant slowdown in demand. In fact, TSA just this week came out and said they've had some of their top days on record ever in TSA's 23-year history. And so I think there's still a strong desire for that leisure travel. And I'm really interested to kind of understand that more myself, because if you're a consumer and you're dealing with this perfect storm of inflation plus student loans plus credit card plus all this stuff, you may not have the appetite for a leisure trip. But it doesn't seem like this is the case.
I know there's so many times, maybe by my like nature, or just by looking at like data or whatever, that I've wanted to be bearish on the American consumer, but they've proven time and time again that they'll spend every last dollar that they have and then some.
Yeah, it's a uniquely American consumer thing too.
So, yeah, no, like the Chinese consumer will, for example, will panic and shift into a mode where they save like 30% of their paychecks. Yeah. But like the Americans are like, it could be like the end of the world, and they're like, oh, maybe we should start putting 4% of our paycheck away for the future.
But yeah, thanks JP for chatting with us. You got anything else you guys observed in the white paper that you wanted to add in?
No, I think that's about it. Obviously a lot depends on passenger demand, and a lot depends on sort of what investors expect, what kind of numbers they expect the airlines to post. But we definitely think capacity growth will be muted, hiring will be muted for the midterm outlook.
Yeah,
let's call it.
All right.
Do you think you guys will do this like every year, every 18 months?
We should. Because we built these huge tables for the first time, and that was quite a bit of work. But updating them is much less work.
They're so helpful. Even when I'm just doing my day-to-day reporting, the earnings stuff you guys put in there, it's great.
Yeah. Cool. So I think we'll keep doing it. That's a good idea.
Oh, you can find the white
paper.
Find the white paper, airlinegeeks.com. We'll put a link in the bio so you all can easily find it. But it's really fascinating. It's a really good read over some coffee to just understand what's going on in the industry. And JP and team do an incredible job. So thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah,
all right.
Thanks, man. All right, I learned a lot with JP.
Yeah, I did too.
I'm just kidding. Best way to support is just to subscribe to any of our magazines: Flying Magazine, Plane and Pilot, IFR, Aviation Safety, Aviation Consumer, and Kit Planes, or our newsletters. If you have any questions, concerns, email us at
insideaviation@firecrown.com
or comment below. And I swear I'll reply like this guy from Alaska last week. Thanks.